Hey, so I recently got a new microphone, so I decided that, what better way to use the new microphone to make a video. So I thought, why not do a video on the fine-tuning argument? There are a lot of popular objections to the fine-tuning argument that I just don't think are any good. I think that the fine-tuning argument is a very successful argument, at least in terms of raising the probability of theism. And so here I'll address a video by the YouTuber Holy Koolaid, where he attempted to debunk the fine-tuning argument. So let's see if he successfully has done that. Okay. Ooh.
Hello, Thomas Westbrook here. Have you ever wondered,
is the universe fine-tuned for life? The fine-tuning argument. The most overused argument in the creationist toolkit. If you're not familiar with the fine-tuning argument, it goes something...
I guess, so he says it's the most overused argument in the creationist toolkit. I think that's a little bit misleading, given that the fine-tuning argument, when you say creationist, the general implication is that God created life specially, that God was deeply involved in the natural world. And that's not what most defenders of the fine-tuning argument think. Rather, they think that the laws of physics are in a very narrow range where they're able to support sort of complex life, and that's more strongly predicted on theism. Where on theism, you would expect there to be laws that are able to sustain life. While in atheism, given how rare it is for there to be laws in the life-permitting range, then that supports theism.
Something like this.
These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's...
I guess the video he's responding to is a little bit misleading, because it's not that every single constant in the universe is finely tuned. It's just that some of them are finely tuned. I don't think all of them are finely tuned, but at least...
Right. No physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere.
If the Earth were just 5% closer to the Sun, it would be subject to the same fate as Venus, a runaway greenhouse effect with temperatures rising to nearly 900 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah, the people he's responding to, I don't think are presenting a very good version of the fine-tuning argument. The best version of the fine-tuning argument isn't that our galaxy specifically is finely tuned, because the universe is very big, so you'd expect there to be, even if life is very narrow, you'd expect there to be life somewhere, and the universe might even be infinite in size. The best version is that if the constants were changed slightly, then no life could have arisen anywhere, no atoms could have formed, no complex structures of any kind would have existed.
Conversely, if the Earth were 20% farther from its home star, carbon dioxide clouds would form in its upper atmosphere, initiating the cycle of ice and cold that has sterilized Mars.
5% and 20% don't sound like much, but that window is 37,399,000 kilometers wide. And Earth's orbit isn't a perfect circle either. It varies widely in its distance to the Sun. With over 100 billion galaxies containing 100 billion stars, many of which have multiple planets, ours has at least 8. Sorry, Pluto. It's not surprising that in just the few years that we've had telescopes and methods to detect them, we've discovered thousands of exoplanets with estimates of as many as 40 billion just in our galaxy that are orbiting around a star in the habitable zone. Now, most of the universe is a dangerous vacuum that's either scorching hot or ice cold, and with no air to breathe, we would die in seconds. In fact, 99.999 ad nauseum % of the universe...
I don't know why I look purple in the recording. It's weird.
Is not suitable for human life. And it took us billions of years to evolve and adapt to this narrow corner of it. So to say that the universe is fine-tuned for life is like saying that the Sydney Opera House was fine-tuned for the speck of mold growing on the crumb of cheese that fell from a lady's pocket 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, okay, so that's the first objection. It's that, thinking that the universe is finely tuned for life is not correct when the universe only has a very small amount of life. But the reason why you wouldn't think that the Sydney Opera House was finely tuned for the scrap of cheese is that there are much better explanations of what the Sydney Opera House is for, right? So, there are lots of other things that it might have been built for, and that there isn't a plausible explanation of why it would be built for that in particular. But in contrast, if you think theism is at least a reasonably likely theory on independent grounds, or at least not terribly unlikely, and then theism predicts the existence of some life, then theism predicting the existence of life, it'll get a big probabilistic boost. And so if it really were, if there were two hypotheses that you were considering between, and one of the hypotheses was there's a being of the type that creates the Sydney Opera House to have this speck of moldy cheese. If that hypothesis was alternatively pretty plausible, then it would get a bit of an upgrade from this. The difference is that the Sydney Opera House, there aren't alternative better explanations of what it's for, and it's not very likely that it would be finely tuned for that. But in contrast with theism, it's true that the universe is not super life permitting, but given that the odds of it being life permitting at all are so low, then the fact that it's life permitting still favors theism, I think, pretty substantially. Now you might think that it's weird on theism that the universe isn't more life permitting. Why isn't there more life? But I don't know why that's that weird. So my view is that I think, if there's a God, and I'm kind of agnostic about that, then you'd expect God to put everyone in the world where their life is best. So if it's best for me to go in this world, then I'd go in this world. And so if that's kind of broadly the conception, then I just don't see a reason to think you'd expect the universe to have lots of people. Because I think God creates every possible person, and then he puts them where their life is best. He puts every soul in the universe that's best for them. And on that theory, we don't have a reason to think that the universe would be super life permitting, because we don't have a reason to make any predictions about how big the universe, how many civilizations per universe is good for a person. I also think that we have some reason to think that God wants to make the universe look broadly indifferent. So have a universe that has us, but have a universe where the universe doesn't seem to care about us. I have a theodicy on this if people are curious. If you go to my blog, benthams.substack.com, you can see where I talk about this theodicy in some depth in an article I have called How to and How Not to Solve the Problem of Evil. So I think theists should already think this in order to solve the problem of evil. But if you're already committed to the view that God wants to make a universe that looks roughly indifferent, then he would do it by natural processes rather than by special creation that's very large. So, and so the analogies are interesting, but the real problem is just the odds that you'd have a universe that has life at all are so low. And on theism, you don't have a reason to think that the universe would be super small and life permitting. And so I don't think it gives you a good reason to favor theism, or to favor atheism.
Allow me to paint a picture for you of what a universe fine-tuned for life might actually look like. Every star would be surrounded with multiple habitable planets, each in perfect equilibrium, and they wouldn't have shifting tectonic plates causing earthquakes or volcanoes. No dangerously sporadic weather conditions would exist, and we would be...
Yeah, so he's talking about lots of features of our world that make it seem not finely tuned. But I think this is just the problem of evil. He's just saying, look at all the bad things that happen in the world. And I think the problem of evil, it's a real problem. It's very hard to answer. I have the theodicy that I mentioned before that I think is the best solution. But I don't think that the problem of evil is, it's important not to double count evidence. And you can't, if the reason why you say it's not finely tuned is that the world is bad, and then you also say the problem of evil is another argument, then you're double counting the evidence. So I agree, it's a puzzle why it's not more finely tuned, but there are lots of explanations that a theist can give. So they might think there are some unknown reasons for God to allow these things. They might think that having these things causes us to go through struggle and build our souls, etc.
be impervious to UV radiation if it existed at all. There would be a higher ratio of land to water, and a greater percentage of the water would be drinkable. The requirements for human life wouldn't be so minuscule and tiny. We'd possibly even be able to survive in outer space and explore it with ease. And while this type of universe may not be able to operate on its own according to our current laws of physics, it wouldn't have to, because it would be held in place by God. The very fact that our universe always adheres to physical constants and operates so well on its own is proof in itself that God is superfluous. We live on a tiny rock.
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting argument that if there were a God, you would expect him to intervene in the natural world rather than to just have the sort of a natural system that just chugs along doing predictable things. Now, I think that's a real puzzle. Now, my explanation for it is that I think, and this is, I think, the view you should adopt if you're a theist, where you say that God wants to put us in a universe that looks indifferent, where the universe doesn't outwardly care about us. Now, he'd provide the minimal requirements on a universe for it to have us and for us to be able to, go through our life conceptualizing ourselves as agents. So we'd have fine-tuning and psychophysical harmony. But he would have us be in a broadly indifferent universe. Now, why would he do this? Well, perhaps spending time in a universe that looks the way the universe actually would if God didn't exist help strengthen our relationship with God, just as, for instance, seeing what it's like for someone in the absence of their spouse might strengthen their relationship with their spouse. You might also think that spending time in a universe like this will build our souls, or that it's required to make us freely choose God, or maybe there are reasons we don't know about. I explore some possibilities in the article that I mentioned before. But if you think that's true, then you're able to solve both this problem and the problem of evil in one fell swoop, which I think, and I think the problem of evil, it's a real problem. So that's I think that's the right way to go.
Hurtling around a massive fireball at death-defying speeds in the vacuum of space. Our planet is bombarded by meteors and asteroids, encompassed with natural disasters, and has undergone at least 5 known mass extinction events. Our primary source of light and energy gives us cancer. Only a fool would say that this planet is intelligently designed. Only a blind lunatic would call it fine-tuned for human life when everything around...
Yeah, so he's saying, it's not finely tuned. But remember, nearly, the odds that, for instance, entropy would be finely tuned enough to produce complex structures is like 1 in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. And so as a result of that, I think, you shouldn't, even if it's not perfectly finely tuned, it's still way more finely tuned than almost 100%, 99.9999999% of possible worlds where there would just be no complex structures forming. So I think it'll still be strong evidence for theism.
Around us is trying to wipe us out. But even though it's not fine-tuned for life, the parameters for life aren't nearly as narrow as we once thought. In the 19th century, it was speculated that man could not survive speeds greater than 50 miles per hour. To show just how laughable that assumption...
Okay, so his view right now is he's saying that it's not as finely tuned as we thought, because maybe life could have formed in different conditions. But the point is, if there hadn't been gravity of the same form, if it had been a bit stronger, then the universe would have all collapsed in on itself. If the cosmological constant had been stronger, it would have all flown apart. If there had been more entropy, it would have just been total random static. And so the point is that, nearly all ways the universe could have been, there would have just been nothing interesting or of value. It's not like, well, maybe life could have formed in other conditions. It's just no 2 protons would interact or anything like that. And then certainly life couldn't form. And this is true just as a conceptual point. You don't even have to look so much at the details of physics. So just imagine, what are the simplest sets of fundamental laws? What are the simplest laws? Well, here's a very simple law. All the particles, they just move in a circle, or move in a square, or move in a triangle, or move in a rectangle, or move in an infinite number of other shapes. These are all very simple hypotheses. And yet and in order to get a universe that produces anything interesting, you actually have to have a very complicated set of laws. And so the fact that we have one of those universes that produces things interacting, things forming complex structures, we really lucked out. And theism has a good explanation of that fact.
Assumption is, astronauts on the Apollo 11 reached speeds of 24,790 miles per hour. Creationists think that the window for life is so tiny. But let's take a look at the tardigrade. This little guy can survive.
So again, this is not relevant because it's not about the conditions in which life can arise. It's about whether or not the universe is capable of sustaining any complex structure at all.
At temperatures as low as minus 328 degrees Fahrenheit. that's minus 200 Celsius, and as high as 300 degrees Fahrenheit or 148.8 Celsius. Radiation? No problemo. They can take doses 1,000 times the lethal dose for humans, and can live on in pressures 6,000 times higher than that of our atmosphere. And we've even found other bacteria that can survive in outer space. The fact is, we just don't know what the limits of life are. Sure, we've adapted to...
Yeah, so again, this is a common objection. Everyone says it, that life could have formed under different conditions. But just know, this is not addressing the fine-tuning argument in the slightest.
This planet, but the requirements for life in other circumstances may be broader than we ever thought possible. If we'd been born in a hotter planet, we would have likely evolved from thermophiles and would have evolved better cooling mechanisms or internal systems that thrive in heat. Would you then say that that planet is so fine-tuned for life? But what about the constants of the universe?
The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist.
That seems pretty crazy, but here's what an actual physicist has to say about it.
There's a famous example that theists like to give, or even cosmologists who haven't thought about it enough, that the expansion rate of the early universe is tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the 60th. That's the naive estimate back of the envelope, pencil, and paper you would do. But in this case, you can do better. You can go into the equations of general relativity, and there is a correct, rigorous derivation of the probability. And when you ask the same question using the correct equations, you find that the probability is 1. All but a set of measure 0 of early universe cosmologies have the right expansion rate to live for a long time and allow life to exist.
Or here's another one.
Consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would, again, be life-prohibiting.
One of the worst fine-tuning problems in nature, which is one of the ones I first proposed, the cosmological constant problem, the dark energy in the universe, the biggest mystery of the universe, that looks like it's incredibly fine-tuned, 120 orders of magnitude, the worst fine-tuning problem in nature. And Dr. Craig will jump up and say, look, if it was a lot bigger, we wouldn't have humans. Well, it turns out if it was precisely 0, which is a much more natural number, more life would form.
Yeah. What about...
Yeah, so now his claim is that really there isn't that much fine-tuning. That kind of if the apologists think that there's fine-tuning, but there really isn't. Now, I mean, really, I think this just goes vastly against the consensus. So Luke Barnes has studied this, has written on this topic extensively, as has Robin Collins. And just there are so many candidates for a finely tuned constant. So, I have the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page pulled up. So the strength of gravity is finely tuned, all these papers on this, the strength of the strong nuclear force. Now, in terms of the example of the cosmological constant, so he says, the probability is exactly 1. I heard the physicist Aaron Wall talk about this video, and he said basically what Carol's saying here just makes no sense at all, where it's like he wasn't even sure what Carol was talking about, because there is a fine-tuning problem for the cosmological constant, and same thing for gravity. The big one is the entropy of the initial universe is very low. The share of phase space, which is the phase space is like the percentage of the possible physics models given by physics that that was a bad description of it. The idea of phase space is that you'll have some probability distribution given by physics, and then you look at the share of it that has particular properties. The share of phase space had by universes resembling the one in which we live is only 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. So I just think, there's quite a strong consensus among the cosmologists. There's very substantial fine-tuning in a lot of areas. And I mean, the one that's easiest to see just intuitively is fine-tuning for the laws. So, even aside from the strengths of the constants being finely tuned, just the laws themselves, they seem to be finely tuned. So, suppose that if there hadn't been gravity at all, then, there would no life could ever have formed. Say that if there hadn't been some force counteracting gravity like the cosmological constant. So the fact that there's these delicate balance of forces that all happen to work together to generate complex structures, that's very strong evidence, I think, for theism. Yeah, so let's see what Mr. Koolaid has to say.
The electroweak force. Well, it turns out it appears fine-tuned if that's the only value we're permitted to alter. But work by Dr. Harnick and colleagues has demonstrated a perfectly viable universe when allowed to tweak other parameters simultaneously, even in the complete absence of the weak force altogether. And if you're concerned with probability...
Oh, yeah, well, so this objection, so the idea is that if you tweak one of the constants, you can get life, but if you tweak multiple of the constants, then you could get life. So, I mean, the idea is, so this does not work because the relevant point is whether something is near. So imagine that a person, there are two ways to get into a house. The first one is by entering a random code at the front door where there are 20 numbers and you have to enter all of them correctly. And the second way is just to walk in through the back door, which is open. Now, suppose a person goes in through the front door. You get evidence that they have some know-how, even though the total probability of them going in is pretty high, because it's very unlikely that they would go in that particular way. And so even if it's true that a sizable share of the possible laws of physics, if you vary multiple of the constants, are conducive to life, then still the odds that life would be in this very narrow range is very low. Would happen to be in this very precarious range. Furthermore, if it's really true that there are these large islands where you tweak the constants, so constants like ours are very unlikely to produce life, but if you change them a lot, then they produce life in other ways. If that were true, then it would be super unlikely that we would be in this part that's really small, this small part of probability space, rather than the much larger part of probability space. It's very unlikely that that if it were the case that only a small share of the possible so let's call a set of laws fragile, a finely tuned laws fragile. If you change them slightly, then you wouldn't have fine tuning. Okay, so if laws are capable of sustaining life, but if you change them slightly, then there would be no life. Then they're fragile. But if you change them slightly, then you would get life. Then they wouldn't be fragile. So if you think that most of the possibility space is dominated by non-fragile laws, then it's really weird that we happened to get fragile laws at all. And so that's the reason to think that this objection is not decisive.
There's no reason to assume that the universe hasn't been expanding and contracting for eternity, or that our universe isn't one of many. The cosmological natural selection theory by physicist Lee Smolin.
Okay, so here his argument is a multiverse. Now, I think the multiverse is the best. That believing the multiverse is the best way to go if you're an atheist. And that's a view I find plausible. I think there is a multiverse, whether atheism or theism is correct. But I don't think that a multiverse is an adequate explanation for a few reasons. First, so the idea of a multiverse is that you kind of have you have a bunch of universes, and then you find yourself in the finely tuned universe, and so then it's no mystery why you're in a finely tuned universe. Now, I think it is a mystery, and I think the multiverse fails as an explanation for a few reasons. First, in order for a multiverse to be simple, you'll have to have the universes fall out of one set of fundamental laws. So there are some fundamental laws that say, these things happen and you get a bunch of multiverses. But the problem is those laws themselves have to be finely tuned. Those laws have to be in the very narrow range of possible laws, which produce a vast multiverse. Okay, and that's not very probable. That's the first problem. The second problem is that even if you have a multiverse, it doesn't solve the problem of fine-tuning for entropy, given that we could have existed in a universe with much more or much less entropy, or with much more entropy. We would just be Boltzmann brains, probably. So the idea, and something that Alexander Prusis talked about, is if there was much higher entropy, then there would be these, lots of random fluctuations where people would randomly fluctuate into existence, live for a few seconds and die. And that would be, if it were the case that there was this vast multiverse, almost every person would end up randomly fluctuating into existence and then dying. It would be extraordinarily rare for the constants of the universe for us to be in the life permitting universe. And so if even with the multiverse, it doesn't solve the problem of why we're not a Boltzmann brain, because there are a huge number of possible Boltzmann brains that we could be. And so in a high universe could still have a high entropy universe could still have us. It just wouldn't have us in a stable Earth. So it would have us just be random fluctuations. And the third problem with the multiverse, I think, is that Robin Collins has talked about how there's fine-tuning not just for life, but for discoverability. So there are a bunch of parts of physics where if you tweak them slightly, then we would still exist, but we couldn't know about deeper facts about physics. So we're in this very narrow range of life-permitting universes where we can discover physics. So that's more strongly predicted on theism, and the multiverse doesn't help explain that.
Posits that black holes may be the way that universes reproduce, each new universe having slightly different physical constants. If that's the case, and there's an infinite number of universes, then even if the creationist assertions about the improbability of life were true, probability would be irrelevant, because even if the chance of life was really...
Yeah, so now he's saying maybe there's an infinite multiverse. But the problem with an infinite multiverse is it breaks down probability, because there just aren't satisfactory ways of doing probability distributions in an infinite multiverse. Now, maybe there's a way to do subject. So I think, if you're a theist, you should think there are infinite people, because God would create every possible person. But in that case, you can do probability based on what you would expect God to do for you in particular. But if you're just sort of a random observer spread throughout the universe, then it's very hard to see how you can do probabilistic reasoning. And that's kind of a difficult problem to get out of in cosmology.
1 in a trillion, then with more than a trillion universes, each with different physical constants, our existence would be a statistical necessity. But rather than our universe being fine-tuned for life, it would be fine-tuned for the formation of black holes, which, given the prevalence of black holes, it certainly appears to be. The universes that don't produce black holes would die out, and the ones that produce the most would become more common. The fact that some of the mass formed would evolve into human life would be an inconsequential byproduct. We inhabit an incomprehensibly tiny speck floating through vast emptiness and chaos. Are we really so arrogantly egocentric as to look up at the night sky and assume that it's all made for us? Is that really a crutch we need to make it through the day?
Yeah, well, so I mean, he says, "Oh, there's a crutch you need to make it through the day," But I mean, I don't know why that's right. I think the thing that matters is whether it's true. And I think we do have a reason to think it's true, given that theism's antecedently at least somewhat plausible. Maybe it has a 1% probability prior to considering fine-tuning. But if you think it has that, and then that the fact that the universe is finely tuned is so unlikely on atheism, it's such a narrow range, and that'll give a good reason to adopt theism. And yeah, I mean, he says, it's such a small percent share of the universe, but I don't see a reason to think on theism why we'd expect us to be a large percent of the universe. There's something malleable about, as I say before, I think that, on theism, you should expect a vast multiverse where every possible person's created. So then the question is just, would people be created in universes with lots of people or with a small number of people? And I see no reason to think that they'd be created primarily in universes with lots of people. There's something valuable about pondering how small you are in this grand universe. And, if the theodicy that I described before is right, then that also explains why we'd be in such a universe.
Starting in extreme conditions, humans and our ancient non-human ancestors adapted to this planet as it cooled. Those of us who couldn't live long enough to reproduce were lost along the way. We have evolved to survive here, fine-tuning ourselves to this planet, not the other way around. We have fought tooth and nail to get to where we are. That's all the more reason to cherish this life and not squander it or destroy the only home we have. I put out a video like this every week now, so if you're able to pledge even just $1 or $2 per video on Patreon, that's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. It would really help me to keep doing this. I'm living in Southeast Asia to stretch out my savings right now, and Holy Koolaid's nowhere near self-sufficient yet. I'd hate to...
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think that was an interesting video. I think it provided a helpful overview of a lot of the objections to fine-tuning. But I basically think all the objections are kind of terrible. I mean, I think the multiverse is the right way to go, where you should think that there's a big multiverse. But even that is it's riddled with problems. Okay, so, some of you were asking questions. So, Alex, you ask so you raised the electrons in love argument. Yeah, I mean, so describing what's wrong with that argument, it gets a little bit complicated, but I do have an article on this. If you go to my blog, benthams.substack.com, or just Google Bentham's Bulldog, and you type in, go to the article titled Theism, or like For Theism Part 1. I can link it in the chat. I address the electrons and love argument in some detail. I mean, the basic point is that on dualism, you could have had valuable relationships between electrons, maybe, but those would have to be kind of in order to get those rules, so that in order for the electrons to produce these complicated interactions between us, you'd have to have these very complicated psychophysical laws. And we have good reason to think that we're not electrons in love. We have reason to think that we're, real people. And so then for that, you have to have fine tuning for the structure. But that was only a very brief overview. The argument specifically is a bit more complicated. So then existential, you ask what I make of Oppie's argument that they're necessary. I mean, that doesn't resolve the problem. It's just saying something's necessary doesn't explain why it is a certain way, given that it doesn't affect the epistemic probability. So if someone gets 100 royal flushes in poker, you don't say, wow, well, it's a mystery resolved because it's necessary that they got it. Instead, you ask, okay, but why is it necessary that they got that rather than something else? So yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching.